This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on developments in Sri Lanka. The participants are Yogendra Kumar, former diplomat, and Sanjay Jha, journalist.
Sri Lanka is facing an economic and political crisis with inflation and severe shortage of fuel and other essential supplies. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa had gone into hiding after protesters stormed his residence on July 9, and his resignation was finally accepted by the parliament speaker. The 225-member parliament will elect a new president by a vote tomorrow. India is the closest neighbor and obviously keeping an eye on the developments in island nation. Central government is holding all-party meeting over Sri Lankan crisis today. What do you think is going on in Sri Lanka?
Well, Sri Lanka is going through an extremely difficult time, and the situation is quite fluid there, because what's actually happening is that this particular election which is taking place in the parliament tomorrow is taking place in the background of the present government having been practically overthrown by street protests. And it shows two things, in my view. One, of course, is that the parliamentary composition as it is now has been unable to actually, in a way, steer the political turmoil and the economic turmoil inside Sri Lanka, even though it's been going on for at least last 3 or 4 months. The second point is that also shows that there is a kind of an inbuilt or intrinsic contradiction between what you have as a current formal political parliamentary system or executive president system and the street protesters. So they are, of course, it's basically spontaneous, in a way, upsurge, but there clearly are different perspectives on their part as to how the current economic and political crisis is to be handled. Therefore, tomorrow's election, as it is being planned, in a way, we'll have to watch very carefully, because it may or it may not lead to the end of the current political crisis. And that end of the political crisis is important before, let's say, the country's leadership can gear itself for tackling the economic crisis. And that's why you can understand in India also the considerable unease. You have an all-party meeting we called today, and already the DMK and the All India Anna DMK, they have already actually been asking the government for intervention. And you can understand it's a very tricky situation, because when our High Commissioner called on the Speaker of the Sri Lankan Parliament, he of course went to give support to the democratic process in Sri Lanka, and of course to say that India is prepared to assist in whatever manner it's possible for, economic development and economic stability. But after he came back from his meeting, there were protests outside the Indian High Commission, because the relationship actually is quite sensitive and delicate between India and Sri Lanka. Therefore, you can understand why the fluidity is so much, and that's why there is also concern amongst the, let's say, our political leaders in India.
Yeah, absolutely. Tamil Nadu, which is the next to the Sri Lanka, and if you see the distance between island country and Tamil Nadu, it's not really that much, and that's why always whenever there is a crisis in Sri Lanka, we see an influx of refugees in the state, and that also affects the security of the state. So the central government is obviously calling for suo motu meeting to address the concerns of the political parties like DMK and AIDMK and in the southern India. But how it has exacerbated in Sri Lanka, people are talking about COVID-19, the failing of tourism industry. What exactly you think has led to this situation in Sri Lanka?
There is a continuing history of political instability in Sri Lanka. For example, if you remember, 2005 you had the presidential elections. That is when Mahinda Rajapaksa came to power. This is before the end of the conflict, in the civil conflict in Sri Lanka, which took place in 2009. But the point is that since that time, no government there or no president has been in a position to actually complete the constitutionally mandated term of 6 years. And every time a president has come to power, there has been this urge in the incumbent that after having consolidated the political position, he should call for fresh elections to further consolidate. And you find, therefore, this kind of turbulence going on. And the last one, of course, was 2019 presidential election, when the previous president, where you had Sri Lanka, who actually defected from Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, he along with Ranil Wickremesinghe, they actually, in a way, the presidential election took place. Sri Lanka was able to defeat Mahinda Rajapaksa, but then even that government was rather unstable, and there was a constitutional crisis, which took place in the constitutional crisis. And then, of course, as you know, that again, you had the Easter bombing, which took place in April 2019. And therefore, the instability has been such, which has then finally led to the emergence of the Rajapakses, in fact, Mahinda, but also Gotabaya, as a strongman kind of a personality, figure, to control the situation. But because of this kind of inbuilt instability, shifting political alliances amongst the existing political parties there, the leaders or the presidents actually have been sort of in one way under some kind of imperative necessity to actually then indulge in much more populistic economic measures, which have all led to economic fragility and received an internal and external shock. Internal shock, of course, was the coronavirus. They handled very well the first wave, but then when the tourism sector collapsed, it aggravated the economic condition in Sri Lanka. And then you have the ongoing Ukraine crisis, leading to fuel price shortages and fuel price hike, and of course the food price hike. So you find now situation become quite tangled at the moment. And we just have to see how it takes this tomorrow. And of course, as I think we're all watching the television and following the news stories from Sri Lanka, generally India's role has been appreciated by all sides. That I think is quite evident. So in one way, we have a lot of stakes and we have a certain amount of influence, so to say, but we're very careful as to how the situation, by watching and maybe perhaps through some kind of means just to see that the political and economic development there is such as to lead to further stability in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. Indian government and Indian establishment is wishing for a stable government in Sri Lanka. After the crisis started and the protest 3-4 months back, Indian government has contributed a lot in terms of food grain. Yesterday, fertilizers were also sent to Sri Lanka. Fuel is also, I think India is the sole supplier right now. So Indian government is of course contributing, and Sri Lankans have also appreciated this fact. How concerned are we in terms of instability in Sri Lanka?
Concerns are quite genuine because of the fact, of course, we have very close ethnic relations, civilizational contacts, relations between the two countries and its proximity. So what happens there actually has an effect on India. That's something that we have to watch. For example, if you remember the spillover of the Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka affected us. Then when you had the Easter bombing, for example, they were concerned that there were some links of these people in southern region of India. That's one side. So you realize how closely we have to work with the Sri Lankan government to see that situation does not remains in a way under control. But even no less importantly, our economic relations are also very strong. You might recall that the Colombo port is a major transshipment point for Indian containers. The containers originating from, let's say, the east coast of India, they all are taken to the Colombo port, most of them, which are westbound. And similarly, the Indian shipping containers originating on the western coast and are eastbound, again, they take into Colombo, and then from there, they transit further east. So you can imagine how closely linked two countries are. And therefore, this is a situation that we have to watch. And apart from the larger issues of regional security and stability and so on and so forth, which we all are very well aware of and we read and write about in our media and elsewhere.
Sri Lankan Parliament has started the process to elect a new president after the astounding people's uprising against Gotabaya Rajapaksa last week and his resignation. Current acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe, Tulas Alha Paramume and Anura Kumara Disanaike are the main three candidates in the fray. So Sri Lanka is going to witness a three-cornered race for presidency tomorrow. Now, with these three candidates coming up, although the voting in the parliament is going to be a secret ballot, what do you think are the stakes for acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's the most veteran politician among all three candidates? He has been the Prime Minister for 6 times. He always wanted to be the President of the country, but never got a chance to get elected. So what do you think is going to happen?
The SLPP, which is the current party in power and which has not the majority, but they are the strongest presence in the Sri Lankan parliament. He is clearly the nominated candidate. Therefore, you can understand that in one way, the Gotabaya Rajapakses and the establishment are actually, in a way, sort of rooting for him and supporting him by whatever means they can. At the same time, as you would recall, that his own private residence was burned down by the protesters. And just yesterday, he once again announced national emergency, giving power to the military and the police to control the situation by all necessary means. So the reason, of course, is that there is a certain amount of distrust between the elected public protesters and the current incumbent acting president. So understand that is one complication in his candidature. The other one, of course, is that Mr. Dulas Alaha Peruma is a Buddhist nationalist, and he actually, in a way, represents again a breakaway faction of the SLPP, and also he commands a certain number of MPs. And in fact, what actually happened is that Sajid Premadasa, who actually is the leader of the SJB party or SJP group, he has withdrawn his candidature in support of Mr. Dullas Alaha Peruma. Of course, it seems there's an understanding between them that when he gets elected, then Mr. Premadasa would become the Prime Minister. So the aim seems to be that they want to wean away as many votes as possible from the SLPP, which is the Rajapakse's kind of a group there. And neither of them is in a position or confident that they actually command the majority. Though, of course, it seemed that Mr. Vikram Singhe's chances seem to be better. But you never know about these things because there's all secret ballot. And the other important point is that Mr. Anur Kumar Disnaike, he is a JVP leader. He's more of a leftist kind of a oriented politician, again, a person who has ministerial experience. And he actually belongs to the other alliance of which you have Mr. Premadas as the leader. So it's quite possible that there might be a kind of a breakage or let's say rupture of the votes on the opposition side. So at the moment, the situation seems to be a little fluid and uncertain. But the important point is that all these developments in a way suggest that there are larger issues in the political scenario that prevails at the moment in Sri Lanka. One is that like JVP, they want that there should be early elections. And Mr. Vikram Singhe is hoping that he will continue for the remaining part of the presidential term, which will last until 2024. At the same time, the protesters, they actually want early elections, number one. Number two, they want actually the abolition of the executive presidency. So in a way, they want to go back to the earlier political system in Sri Lanka, which is more like the Westminster kind, the prime ministerial system like we have in India. Then again, the question as to what kind of an economic policy will be pursued by whichever, let's say, candidate actually becomes the president after the election parliament. So there is inbuilt contradiction in the situation. And therefore, there is a degree of fluidity because even, for example, this national emergency which has been declared, has been declared about 3 times earlier. And each time they've had to withdraw because the public pressure was so much that the police found it difficult to actually control the situation. So you see, there's an inbuilt kind of tension on the street at the moment. And therefore, at the moment, the situation to me seems to be somewhat. But, there are still several hours ahead. So we don't know what kind of further alliances and political combinations are emerging amongst the members of the Sri Lankan parliament. And we just have to wait and see.
You mentioned that the Rajapakses, Sri Lanka, Podujana, Perumana, SLPP or People's Front, what it is nominally, they are obviously supporting Ranil's candidate. But the party appears divided on its preferred presidential candidate as Mr. Gotabaya's successor, while the General Secretary has recently announced support for acting President Mr. Vikram Singhe. The chairman has placed support for another candidate, Mr. Allapurama, who was earlier with the Rajapakse camp. So if you see the political development, and since it's a secret battle, and Rajapaksa family is firmly backing Mr. Vikram Singhe, so it remains to be seen how members of their party might vote, because it may not be one-sided vote entirely supporting Mr. Vikram Singhe. Now also opposition leader Mr. Premdasa is pulling out of the race and now throwing his weight behind Mr. Allapurama, hoping that he will win and then he can become the Prime Minister. So the contest may have just got harder for Mr. Vikram Singhe, who has been hoping to become the President of the island nation. What do you think about the division within the SLPP?
I would actually say that the party system is not very strong there. I mean, for example, SLPP is very much a party controlled by the Rajapaksa family, for example. But so you can say about the other political groupings and parties. So because of this kind of a very fluid sort of practice of alliances, breaking of alliances, joining and making these kind of combinations, it's very difficult to say. But I think that's the kind of thing which is now, they're talking about. But it is quite likely that some of the members of parliament, they would be seeing as to how they can, what is the best way in which the larger national context, what's the best way they can actually first create some stable government. Because I think practically everybody is talking about all-party government, which has not happened before. If there are 3 candidates contesting for the president's position, so one doesn't know that whatever the outcome of this presidential election in the parliament.
Let's hope that Sri Lanka with the new president becomes more stable and peaceful country. The normalcy returns soon. Thank you very much for your time and letting us your view about the developments in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You were listening to a discussion on developments in Sri Lanka. The participants were Yogendra Kumar, former diplomat, and Sanjay Jha, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.